So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the United Nations banquet hosted by the Wichita Global Learning Center. I'm Angela Demovic, and I've had the pleasure of serving as the current president of the board. For those of you who may be new to us, the Global Learning Center has been part of the Wichita community since 1988. We are a group of community members and lifelong learners with a shared mission to provide meaningful educational opportunities on global issues, to support constructive international dialogue, and to promote greater global awareness and understanding, all in pursuit of a more peaceful and connected world. While the individuals involved have changed over the years, our dedication to education and global engagement has remained strong and constant. In 1989, we hosted our very first United Nations banquet. We've continued the annual tradition almost every October since then to recognize and celebrate United Nations Day and the anniversary of the entry into force of the UN Charter. In addition to this annual event, we've offered monthly programs for over 3 decades, creating space for important conversations that help connect our local community with global perspectives. If you're just joining us for the first time tonight, we'd like to invite you to our future events, which are usually held on the 3rd Sunday of each month. So please make sure and leave us with your email if you'd like to be receiving information on our upcoming events. Tonight is always one of the highlights of our year, and we're thrilled to have you here to share in the tradition. We have a meaningful program ahead, including the presentation of the Howard and Jeannie Johnston Global Citizenship Award and a keynote speaker that we're especially excited about. So to begin our evening, I'd like to welcome the Johnston family to the stage to share a few words. So please, if we can begin our program, let me introduce Dave Johnston. This one's better.
Thank you. I hope you'll indulge me to keep this as short as possible. I'll read how the award came to be and how the Global Learning Center was born. My father, or our father, Howard Johnston, experienced the terrible consequences of war when he served in the South Pacific during World War II. He resolved that war was not a solution to world problems, and he committed his life to diplomacy and education as alternative to war. After the war, he and his wife and our mother, Jean, worked in governmental and academic settings pursuant to those goals. In 1988, they founded the Global Learning Center along with other founders in the Wichita area. In 2000, the Global Learning Center established the Howard and Jean Johnston Global Citizenship Award. This award is presented annually to individuals or couples who have made an outstanding contribution to global and current events, learning, and conflict resolution. And I'm very proud of my parents for having done so. Thank you. Very good.
Okay, thank you very much. So next I'd like to introduce our board vice president, Easton Vogt, and he's going to introduce the recipient of this year's Global Citizenship Award.
Hello. Okay, I'm going to do a really quick introduction of Aonya. She's really important to me. I see many faces here that I know, so it's just nice to see everyone here. I will start. Aonya Barnett is a prevention and harm reduction practitioner and entrepreneur committed to advancing health equity, overdose prevention, and community well-being. She is the founder and executive director of Safe Streets Wichita, Inc., the first community-based organization in Wichita to provide intramuscular naloxone and lead to comprehensive grassroots response to substance use and overdose. Under her leadership, Safe Streets Wichita successfully advocated for the expansion of the Good Samaritan law to include protections in cases of fatal overdose. The organization also develops and implements programs focused on life skills, education, community health worker training, and equitable access to prevention resources. Anya's work extends across several key initiatives supported by the Federal Drug-Free Communities Grant, the state's Kansas Department of Disability and Aging Services Family Grant, KDADS Community Suicide Prevention Grant, and the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant. Each initiative strengthens prevention networks, expands access to life-saving tools, and builds bridges between public health, behavioral health, and community care. Her vision for Safe Streets Wichita is rooted in addressing the social and economic determinants of health, factors such as housing, employment, education, and community safety that shape well-being. By centering people most affected by systemic inequalities, Aonya works to create pathways towards stability, empowerment, and long-term health. Through collaboration, advocacy, and education, she continues to lead efforts that reduce harm, promote recovery, and build a foundation for healthier, more resilient communities. So I would like to talk about some of my personal, aspect, just real quick, of just the importance of this to me, of global learning is something that I think I learned just by entering college, that it was a necessity to understand just the world we're in. You cannot understand your own life without understanding the world and just seeking knowledge, but not just for that, but to help others. I think that is the most important role of knowledge, is to help others. And I can't think of a better person than Aonya Barnett and her whole team, honestly, at Safe Streets. So I would like to present the award to you. We'll take pictures after.
I'll be ready. Yes, thank you. Good evening. It's great to be in community with you on today. Thank you for that introduction, Easton. Thank you so much to the Johnston family for the namesake of the award and also for sponsoring our tables today. I give an honor to the divine for creating me, for my mother for being the vessel, my family, my partners, my coworkers. This is my family, y'all, and I'm so happy to be here. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay. My one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Lucille Clifton. I begin with Lucille Clifton because her words remind me that survival is sacred. Every day I work with people who use drugs, and survival is sacred. Creation is sacred. To build something from nothing, to love people in a world when you're often overlooked, to keep choosing hope, this is holy work. I was born in the 80s, a child of the 90s, and came into the 2000s learning how to make a way out of no way. I was raised by a generation that turned struggle into strategy and pain into purpose. That same spirit, the one that taught me to get up, to keep building, to love hard, to fight harder, that's the spirit of my ancestors. Tonight I honor them. The ones who crossed rivers and borders, who picked up pieces, made something beautiful out of what was broken. I stand here because they survived, because their prayers built the bridge that carried me here. When I founded Safe Streets, I carried them with me. I wanted to create what didn't exist, a space rooted in compassion, care, and courage. I'm looking at you two, Kat and Morgan. We became the first community-based organization to do this shit, and I'm proud of you. I'm proud of us. I'm proud of what we represent. From grassroots all the way to the state capitol, we've advocated for the folks who typically are on the margins. We fought for the expansion of the Good Samaritan law to protect those who act in love when every second counts. We built programs that teach life skills. We train community health workers. We open access to harm reduction and to prevention services. Through the various grants that we've gotten and didn't get, we've strengthened networks of care and extended our reach across Kansas. But beyond programs and policy, this work is us. This is our lives. I wore this same dress to my brother's wedding 3 years ago when he died by an accidental overdose. This is a full circle moment for me. I am the living legacy, the legacy of Black women who stand up, who protect their communities, who go forward, who progress despite. Because when Black women thrive, we all thrive. It's Zora Neale Hurston telling us her story so the truth would never die. It's Alice Walker seeing the beauty where others see brokenness. It's Lucille Clifton writing survival into poetry. It's every mother, organizer, healer who taught us that care is not weakness. It is our power. It's our protest. It's our prophecy. So when the work gets heavy, because it does, I remind myself, don't get scared. Let this radicalize you. Let it stretch your compassion. Take care of those who are brave enough to show up, because those who live on the margins often carry the wisdom that holds the world together. Our vision at Safe Streets is to build on truth and health. It's more than medicine. It's housing. It's employment. It's education. It's safety. It's true prevention. That means centering the people most harmed and the ones often pushed aside and trusting them to lead. To my man, thank you to my man, my husband. I appreciate you. Thank you for loving me, even when times are tough. I appreciate you. To my children, you are my heart and my horizon. Children are the closest thing to God, and I truly believe that. When I look at you all, I really see the purest form of grace. You remind me of why I fight, why I serve, and why I love. You teach me to stay tender even when the world is hard. My family reminds me that tomorrow is worth building. This award is not mine alone. It belongs to my team, my partner, my family, my community, and my ancestors. It belongs to everyone who believes that compassion is power and that love, real radical love, can change the world. So yes, Lucille Clifton, I will celebrate with you. We will celebrate that every day something has tried to kill us and has failed. We will keep building this bridge between starshine and clay for our ancestors, for our children, and for those yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're so glad to have you here with us tonight, Ms. Barnett, and everybody from Safe Streets. We appreciate you being here. And thank you also to the Johnston family for being here this evening and for supporting us. Without further ado, I would like to introduce James Phillips. He is a former president of our board and a current board member, and he's going to tell us a little bit about our keynote speaker and introduce her.
Okay. What's that? Use the microphone here? Oh my. This works. I prefer this. Okay. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Rebecca Shute. The title of her talk is The Indispensable Role of International Law and Human Rights in a Chaotic Time. Dr. Shute has a Juris Doctorate degree from Emory University School of Law, a master's degree in democracy and democratization from University College in London, and a certificate in public international law from the Hague Academy of International Law. She is a member of the District of Columbia Bar. Rebecca is co-founder of the Legal Alternatives to War campaign to promote the universality and/or jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. And as you mentioned, Howard, I was thinking of she's involved in this an organization that seeks legal alternatives to war. I think Reese Howard was here. Rebecca is also co-founder of the Washington Group for the International Criminal Court and convener of the Impact Coalition for the Strengthening of Judicial Institutions, among other positions. She has a long list of activities, both past and present, which I won't have time to discuss. She has numerous publications, including an article titled "How the International Criminal Court Turned into a Power Play." And it appears in the Emory International Law Review. Sorry. Now, besides her legal work, I should mention she does some other activities out of her legal work. She's been involved in some theater production, doing writing and acting and directing. So tonight, Dr. Shute will address the current challenges and opportunities for international law, human rights, and democratic institutions. So now I want to present to you Rebecca Shute.
Thank you, Jim, for that far too kind introduction. And to the Global Learning Center, I have only been in Wichita, Kansas for less than 24 hours, and am already invigorated and inspired by your work to continue in mine. And I would like to also recognize the family of Howard Johnston. And I'm so glad that, Jim, you mentioned legal alternatives to war. Our campaign will be coming back to that. Is very much in the spirit that you mentioned. And I also would like to, before beginning my talk, direct some remarks to the wonderful recipient of your award this evening. It might seem an odd pairing to have me, an international lawyer, and you, a local activist, side by side. But your words are such a powerful reminder that justice begins close to home in our communities, our lived experiences, and our struggles for dignity. And while I'd like to explore how that same pursuit of justice has evolved on a global scale and how we've tried to take these moral instincts that guide us locally and translate them into international law, institutions, and norms that bind even the most powerful. These are not distant courts and abstract institutions. They are the only, in some cases, avenues for justice for victims and survivors of the most atrocious crimes. So with that, I will orient my talk in 3 parts. We can consider this 3 acts. I've been told that the TED Talks are only 18 minutes long, and I've been given a full hour. So while I hope that you enjoy the sound of my voice for that long, we're going to break this up a little bit. We're also going to have some interactive elements. We're also going... Great, thank you. So we're going to have some interactive elements between each of these parts. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the invention of international law. And I believe there are some historians probably among us. But for those who are not, we will make this relevant and we will make it brief. Then we will look at the current architecture of international law and judicial institutions, and the patchwork quilt, that encompasses our current system of accountability. And then we'll look to the next steps forward. And there will give you also some opportunities where you actually can get involved, because these are very evolving institutions, as we will speak about. So, firstly, the fragile invention of international law. When we speak about international law today, we often treat it as a given. We think that the UN, human rights, war crimes tribunals, that is something that has always existed, or a permanent fixture of our world order. But actually, in truth, international law is a very recent invention, as I'll explain, an experiment less than a century old. And like all human inventions, it can weaken, it can be manipulated, and it can disappear. We'll return to each of those themes. And so what I want to suggest today is that the system that we call international law, from the United Nations Charter to the International Criminal Court, rests on surprisingly thin historical foundations. It represents not the natural evolution of civilization, but a hard-won and still incomplete effort to place limits on the exercise of power. So, before international law, for most of human history, relations among communities were governed by, not by law, but by power, by custom. Empires rose and fell, alliances were made and broken, tributes were paid, rules where they existed were local or sacred, not universal. And there were codes of conduct, treaties between kings and kings. Yes. Oaths between rulers, religious norms about warfare, but these were fragile, local, and unenforced. And they depended entirely on who had the bigger army that year. So there were no standing institutions to interpret, enforce, or even consistently record them. So empires were ruled by conquest, borders were drawn by force, and if one kingdom invaded another, there was no court to hear a case, no treaty organization to appeal to, only the battlefield. So when we trace the origins of international law, we're not describing the gradual unfolding of a timeless order. We're really describing a radical intellectual project, an attempt to imagine that even states, the ultimate holders of force, could be subject to rules. And when people say international law isn't working, it's worth remembering that the idea that there should be law between nations is itself revolutionary. Okay, let's take the next step here. So we see Grotius and the dream of law between nations. So this project begins with Hugo Grotius in the early 17th century. Writing amid Europe's religious wars, Grotius proposed something extraordinary, that there is indeed a law that exists among nations, grounded not in divine command, nor royal decree, but in human reason. And he argued that states are part of a moral community bound by common rules, and that even in war, there are limits. But let's not make any mistake here. At this time, this was philosophy, not reality. It was a bold, almost utopian thought. And for centuries, it remained mostly that, a thought, not a practice. So Grotius's law of nations existed on parchment, but not in practice. Still, his idea that sovereignty is not absolute and that certain acts are unlawful no matter who commits them, plants a seed that would take centuries to grow. So, again, this is not going to be all a history lesson, but I'm going to fast forward a little bit. So, for almost 200 years after Grotius, international law meant little more than the etiquette of diplomacy. And in the late 19th century, we begin to see something closer to a system. Treaties on war and peace, war conventions on humanitarian conduct, the first attempts to codify the laws of war. And by the late 1800s, the world had changed. There was industrialization, the innovation of telegraphs, global trade, and states were bumping into each other constantly. And then at the dawn of the 20th century, 1899, we celebrated the 125th anniversary last year, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia called for an international conference to discuss disarmament and the peaceful settlement of disputes. And the result of that was the first Hague Peace Conference of 1899 in The Hague, the very country of Grotius's birth. So the Hague Conference represented the first great attempt to create a legal framework for peace among nations. And there were delegates from more than 24 states. However, as we well know, both in 1899 and 1945, we'll fast forward in some time, most of the nations of the 193 that are currently member states of the United Nations did not exist. And of course, in 1899, no women were allowed to participate in the peace conference. It still signaled the beginning of a transition from international relations governed by the law of force to the force of law. And from a notion that the normal course of action, according to, for example, General Claus von Clausewitz, a Prussian general and military theorist who exemplified the spirit of his time, that war was not considered a failure, but a real political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse, a carrying out of same by other means. So in The Hague in 1899, we see a marked shift. And there, the Brazilian delegate, Roya Barbosa, observed, justice is the foundation of society, and its cornerstone is the resolution of disputes through reason and law, not through force. And the Russian diplomat there struck a galvanizing chord. War is an ordeal by fire, and it is a duty of civilized nations to mitigate it as far as possible. So, the 1899 conference achieved several milestones, including the establishment of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the Convention on the Laws and Customs of War on the Land, and declarations banning certain weapons. But we well know that it was not successful in its ultimate goal of abolishing war. The same countries that signed those peace conventions were at war with each other 15 years later. These were rules without teeth. And yet a direct lineage can be traced back from that unprecedented gathering in The Hague to current efforts to support the rule of law globally. So a member of the American delegation to the conference, Andrew Dickinson White, said of its aspirations, if the world is to have any soul, it is ever to rise out of materialism. It will be work such as this. So this work does and must continue. And we know that when World War I erupted in 1914, those same powers unleashed total war on an industrial scale. The Hague Convention didn't prevent the shelling of cities or the use of poison gas. And without the participation of key powers and without mechanisms of enforcement, the League of Nations failed. The invasions of Manchuria, Ethiopia, and Poland exposed its impotence. And by the late 1930s, international law again yielded to the law of force. Yet, the intellectual groundwork for something new, something stronger, was already being laid. So we had the notion that the individual should have rights under international law and that crimes against humanity required legal accountability. So while the dream of a legal order among states remained just that, a dream, the Hague conferences were a reminder that a law without commitment is just paper. And these ideas would find expression after 1945 in the ashes of war. So now we move from the long 19th century in codification to the 20th century, from catastrophe to codification. So this took the legacy of 2 world wars to forge something new. The League of Nations was obviously the first effort to make peace collective. And then again, after World War II, the world tried again, this time though with real institutions. The United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, and the Nuremberg tribunals. So in 1945, with the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Allied powers faced a question the world had never before confronted: how to bring to justice leaders responsible for atrocities on such an unprecedented scale. So the solution, the International Tribunal at Nuremberg and also the International Tribunals in Tokyo, was both radical and transformative. So at Nuremberg, something truly new happened. For the first time, individuals, not just states, were put on trial under international law. So this was the first time in history that the international community declared that individuals would be held criminally responsible for violations of international law. And the Nuremberg Charter established 3 core categories of crimes: crimes against peace, which is the planning and waging of aggressive war crimes, which is the violation of the laws or custom of war, which would then be codified in Geneva Conventions, crimes against humanity, murder, enslavement, and persecution on racial, political, or religious grounds. And so those categories drew upon centuries of legal thought, from Grotius's jus ad bellum and jus in bello distinctions, so the law of going to the war and the laws that govern you when you're in war, taken from the Latin, and that law must reach these individuals who are affected directly. I want to take a moment of pause for criticism of Nuremberg, because critics have, I think, rightly called Nuremberg victor's justice. But its legacy endures precisely because it established a normative and legal precedent that there are limits to sovereignty, and that certain acts are crimes under international law itself, regardless of domestic authority. So Nuremberg also seeded institutions that shape our world to this day, and those are the Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and eventually, even much later, and we'll get to this in a moment, the International Criminal Court, which is also headquartered fittingly in The Hague. So the Charter of the United Nations, we're celebrating as much as we can be celebrating, commemorating maybe is a better word, the 80th anniversary of the UN Charter this year, turned Grotius's philosophical views into political architecture. So it prohibited the use of force, except in self-defense or under Security Council authorization. We'll come back to the Security Council, don't worry. It established a framework for collective security, and it affirmed human rights as a universal concern. So in other words, the modern international legal order that we now speak of, or maybe sometimes take for granted, was born less than 80 years ago. Less than the lifetime of an average human these days. And so when you think about this timeline, Grotius in 1625, The Hague in 1899 and 1907, Nuremberg in 1945, you realize like something striking for 99% of recorded human history, there was no such thing as enforceable international law. What we have today is an experiment conducted in the aftermath of global catastrophe, a structure designed to prevent the return of world war, genocide, and empire. And it has never been secure. Every generation since 1945 has tested its boundaries. In Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, in Balkans, Rwanda, Iraq, Ukraine, Gaza. Each time the question resurfaces, are we ruled by law or by power? And so the institutions that we build, the UN, the International Court of Justice, the ICC, remain dependent on the will of states. These institutions have no army, no police, no sovereignty of their own. That means international law exists only as long as states and citizens believe in it and act as if it matters. So today we often talk about the rules-based international order as if it were a natural law, like gravity. But history tells us otherwise. This order was constructed by people who had seen the abyss, and it endures only if we defend it. When powerful states ignore the prohibition on aggression, for instance, when human rights are dismissed as cultural preference, when war crimes go unpunished because accountability is inconvenient, each time the system frays. But international law has always advanced through crisis. Grotius wrote in wartime, the Hague Conventions followed imperial rivalry, Nuremberg rose from the ashes of genocide. The real test is whether it can survive peace, whether it can remain meaningful without catastrophe, to remind us of why it exists. I'm going to have a couple remarks here, and then as I forecasted, I'm going to invite all of the participants here, I won't call you audience, I'll call you active participants, to engage in a little exercise before I move on to the next chapter of my talk. So I will conclude this Act 1 with the fragile achievement that international law is not the endpoint of civilization, it's the experiment of civilization. So if we trace the line from Grotius to the Hague to Nuremberg, we see the evolution from moral philosophy to codified law, from state diplomacy to international institutions, and from abstract justice to individual accountability. When we speak about the international rule of law today, we're invoking a tradition that's 4 centuries in the making, a tradition born in the imagination of a scholar, tested in the crucible of war, and realized, however imperfectly, in courts of justice. Power still distorts justice, but the very idea that we can speak of crimes against humanity, for instance, that we can hold leaders accountable before international tribunals, and that the conduct of states is subject to law rather than merely to their intent, that is the legacy of Grotius redefined and refined through centuries of struggle and catastrophe. So Grotius's book didn't end the wars of his time. The Hague didn't stop World War I, and Nuremberg didn't prevent every atrocity that happened in the 20th century. But each was a declaration that humanity can and must do better than force alone. So now I'd like to move to the interactive portion. This is not a quiz, but we have 3 scenarios here. And the idea is to explore whether or not they would have been legal under international law at the time given. And so we have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 tables, I think. But I'm going to ask that each table perhaps assign a rapporteur or somebody to give feedback on what you think about these questions. We'll give about 3 minutes for this portion of the activity. And so I'm going to ask you to contemplate what you think about each of these in terms of their legality under the laws of the time. And you're not lawyers. I'm not expecting you to be, just based on what we have recently discussed. So scenario one is a country invades a neighbor to seize territory in 1850. Scenario two is a general orders the bombing of a city full of civilians in 1916. And scenario 13, sorry, it's cut off a little bit on the end, a political leader orchestrates genocide in 1944. So you could, can everybody read those? Clear? Yeah. Yeah, great. So if each of your tables could take a few moments, and then I'll come to each of you perhaps and walk around the room, and we'll also then have some of you come up and speak about why you have reached your decision on whether or not this would be legal. Okay? Is that clear? And remember, this is at the time given. So those years, 1850, 1916, 1944. All right, folks, I'm going to say 1 minute. So if each of your tables could pick a spokesperson, that would be wonderful. Okay, so can I get a hand from a table who would like to start us off with scenario 1? A country invades a neighbor to seize territory in 1850. Is this legal at that time under international law or not? Please, a hand. I see a hand over here. And him first, and then you, Jim. Or you start just for the first person.
We said that it was probably all of them were legal at the time indicated. Oh, scenario 1? Yeah, scenario 1 was legal. I think Easton said something about the invasion of Mexico and that, oh, the invasion of California, and that was probably what you were talking about.
Thanks. Would you like to go next, Jim?
Okay. I think there's consensus here that on number 1, that in 1850, that was not that was legal in 1850. At number 2, there's some disagreement on that. But of course, the Hague Convention was adopted before there was aerial bombardment. But because the Hague Convention, as I understand it, prohibited the killing of civilians in cities that were being defended, that at number 2, if those cities weren't being defended, so it depends on whether their cities weren't being defended, then it would be illegal under the Hague Convention. But if they were being defended, then it would be legal. It depends on whether they were defending or not. And number 3, I didn't hear everyone what they thought of that. The political leader, or of course, that's before the Genocide Convention.
Before Nuremberg.
But of course, Nuremberg, that trial was not under the convention on Genocide Convention because it hadn't been passed. But I think under customary law, perhaps, and I'm not sure about this, but you can that is illegal. At least the judgment in Nuremberg said so, didn't they? Yeah. So.
Here. Can I just see some hands of anybody else who would like to take the floor? So I know how many people to come around to. Over there.
First of all, the first scenario is somehow not valid. If we take the Europe at this time, there were not any countries, only federation. For example, Italy, Belgium, and other, they were formed only at the end of 19th century. So the second scenario, if you take bombing a city full of citizenship, if you would take the development of airplanes, it was very rare, to have a good airplane army at this time. So the whole hypothesis is also not legal, period. It doesn't exist. And the third scenario, a political leader orchestrated genocide, 1949. If you look at this time, 1949, the only political leader was in Germany at that time. 1944.
We do have answers. This is actually a question that does have concrete answers under international law.
I think scenario 1 probably was legal. The example could have been the United States seized Mexican territory around that time, Mexican-American War. Scenario 2, a general orders the bombing of a city of civilians. It wasn't by airplanes, but perhaps by Big Bertha, a siege gun in Germany that targeted Paris. Third scenario, political leader orchestrates a genocide in 1944. I'm not sure who that would have been, but probably Hermann Goering or Heinrich Himmler. Adolf itself could have been that person that would orchestrate genocide. And they were all legal at that time because there were not any laws of jurisdiction.
Thank you so much to all of you for your inputs. Let's point out that each of these scenarios. Okay, one more table. And by the way, this is the first of 3 exercises, so everybody will have the chance to contribute.
I guess scenario 1 that might is right ruled. In the second one, maybe bombing by Zeppelin by the Germans of England. And the third one, the plan for genocide, at least on the Jews, was developed in 1942 at the Swansea Conference. But I wonder if another leader at that time decided that it was convenient if he turned over certain ethnic or other group to the Germans, knowing their fate.
Thanks, John. So as we see, these scenarios have dates behind them, and many of you have guessed what those dates, correctly, of course, what those dates infer. Each of these is happening in 2025, and the answer, of course, in 2025 is each of these is illegal. The answer is that none of these were illegal at the time. So in the case of scenario 1, it wasn't illegal yet because wars of conquest were still accepted state practice. And while the Hague Conventions had already been adopted by 1916, there was no enforcement mechanism and they were not seen as legally binding. And then in scenario 3, there were emerging norms at that time, but somebody, maybe it was you who mentioned that the Convention of Genocide wasn't defined until 1948, and ratifications followed pretty shortly thereafter, as opposed to other international conventions. But yes, still left a major lacune in international law. So I guess some of this is still surprising to me. And I'll move on to the next stage of my talk because I think I'm a little bit over time, but I would invite you to think about what surprised you in terms of those answers. And the main point that I wanted to illustrate through that exercise is that the idea that these acts are illegal is so recent, and we can't take this for granted. And it really depends on the law continuing to evolve and be respected. And so this brings us to the modern era of who enforces the rules. And I'm going to attempt, and maybe I'll entertain some questions. We have time for questions and answers here, but at the end, but also if there's any clarifying points about the modern institutions of international law, because there's I think a lot of uncertainty, skepticism, and confusion maybe around them. So we just spoke about how international law is a fragile invention and how it only really took shape in the past century. Because after World War II, it wasn't enough to say there should be law between nations, but the question then became who enforces it. And we turned to principles like no aggression, no genocide, respect for human rights, and tried to translate those into action, into courts, judges, and consequences. And so here's where the modern system comes in. The International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the regional human rights courts, and a patchwork of special tribunals that together form the living architecture of international law. And today, this experiment, it's not one big court, it's a complex web. And in 2025, I can tell you based on my lived experience, that system is under real strain. So at the top of the modern architecture, so to speak, is the International Court of Justice, sometimes called the World Court. And this is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, based in The Hague, enshrined in the UN Charter. And this is not a criminal court. It doesn't convict individuals. It decides cases like Nicaragua v. United States, where Nicaragua can accuse the United States of using force illegally to fund Contras. This was in 1986. By the way, the United States vowed not to adhere to that decision, but ultimately the publicity and the visibility and the awareness of the United States practice of funding Contras led to domestic litigation in the Federal District of Columbia, and ended the practice, and also paved the way for peace agreements throughout Latin America, throughout Central America, in particular beyond Nicaragua. So we see here even where a decision necessarily isn't enforced by the losing party, in this case the United States, that it actually has long-lasting ramification. And fun fact, a backbencher for the Department of Justice representing the United States in that case later became the president of the International Court of Justice, Judge Joan Donoghue, whose term ended last year. Another example of a case before the International Court of Justice, and we'll come back to this in a minute, is Ukraine v. Russia, which alleges misuse of the Genocide Convention to justify invasion. So we're going to be talking about several genocide cases, but this is an interesting one because actually the basis of Ukraine v. Russia is that genocide has been misconstrued by the defending party, the defending state, the Russian Federation. So then half a century after the ICJ came another institution, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and it was established by the Rome Statute in 1998 and became operational in 2002. And it's quite different from the ICJ. Often these institutions, it's easy to conflate them or confuse them, but the ICC prosecutes individuals for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression, and it's not a UN body like the ICJ. It's actually created by its own statute, the Rome Statute of 1998, and that's a treaty that currently binds 125 states, but soon to be 124 when Hungary's withdrawal becomes effective. And so the guiding idea behind the ICC is that the worst crimes concern all humanity, so there must be a court that stands above national borders. I'd also like to just talk briefly about this web of ad hoc and regional tribunals, because I think they're often overlooked within the dialogue about ICC and ICJ. And so we have some regional human rights courts. These include the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the African Court of Human and People's Rights. And they hear disputes by individuals against their state. So that's the difference between a human rights court and a international criminal court and the International Court of Justice, which is state dispute based. So these courts enforce human rights obligations day to day, including freedom of expression, fair trial, non-discrimination, and the micro law that affects millions, not just war crimes. And then there are also special tribunals that have been created for specific purposes, like the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or from the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Special Court for Sierra Leone, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, which was a hybrid court. And what is important is that each of these paved the way for the ICC, the only permanent court seized of these crimes, and that also there is a need for them to continue. And here we see the principle of complementarity. So complementarity is a kind of legalese sort of word, but it basically means that the International Criminal Court acts as a court of last resort. If a state investigates and prosecutes alleged crimes and does so in a thoroughgoing manner, then the ICC steps back. And so this principle respects sovereignty while ensuring accountability doesn't vanish behind borders. So when I have been on the Hill, for instance, advocating for the ICC, one of the points that I make is that if you fear the ICC's jurisdiction, you're ostensibly saying that you don't think that your domestic jurisprudence is up to par, that you don't think that you're willing or able to prosecute these crimes. Even if you make a cursory effort to prosecute, once again, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, crime of aggression, then you don't need to fear the ICC. This is complementarity in action. And I want to also give an example of cooperation between different international courts and tribunals where multiple courts are involved and seized of the same issue. And that this is not, well, it might not be neat. The architecture might not be neat. It is also, how shall I put this? It's not a mess. It's intentional. So let's take one case study. I'll take the case study first of Myanmar. So I think many of you, based on maybe Jim's talk or your own scholarship and your own awareness of what's going on in the world today, are aware of the ongoing crisis of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. So here we have multiple courts and, in fact, different UN actors seized of the issue. Who can be held to account? How can they be held to account? Where can they be held to account? So beginning after the 2017 advent of the atrocities against the Rohingya population, so different legal bodies became involved. We have, on the one hand, this isn't actually in the order, it's not in chronological order, but it's in the order of which I presented the different courts and tribunals. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, is hearing the case, the Gambia v. Myanmar, where the Gambia accuses Myanmar of violating the Genocide Convention. So some preliminary objections that were brought by the defendant in that case, Myanmar, represented by the junta government, were, number one, why does Gambia have a stake in this? Why does it matter? Even if we were committing genocide against the Rohingya people, why does Gambia care? It's a small West African country. It has nothing to do with us. And there, the International Court of Justice found seminally that a crime of genocide is of an ergo omnes nature. Now, I'm sorry, I'm not going to use too much more Latin, but that means it's a crime against all. And so anyone that commits genocide is affecting everyone, all of humanity. And so it ruled out Myanmar's objections of jurisdiction. It also ruled out other complaints that Myanmar had, such as that the Gambia was a front for the Islamic Organization of States, which indeed did a lot of the legwork to foment the case. But it was the Gambia that brought it. And so we have this case before the ICJ. But this is state v. state. And so who will be held responsible? It will be whomever and this will be a question because actually the government of Myanmar is now contested, but whomever the head of government of Myanmar and the state of Myanmar would be, who would be held accountable in that case. So at the same time, the International Criminal Court has an investigation into the atrocities allegedly, I'll come in a second, allegedly committed in Myanmar. And here I'm going to actually just bring in a little bit of my personal history. I was part of the pretrial chamber team that ruled on jurisdiction in the ICC case because Myanmar is not a state party to the Rome Statute, the foundational statute of the ICC. Bangladesh is. So we found that the crime in the pretrial decision that gave jurisdiction over this crime, we found that deportation was a continuous crime that ended on the territory that the person was deported to. So by virtue of Bangladesh being a state party, we got a way in for jurisdiction. And that is not jurisdiction over all crimes, though. It's not jurisdiction over alleged genocide. It's not jurisdiction over other crimes against humanity and war crimes. I have a question over here, so I'm going to come to that.
I'm glad to hear that any nation can bring a case, but why was it the Gambia? Why wasn't it Norway or Japan or one of the countries with a lot more resources one would imagine might step up in these situations?
I would almost flip that question on its head. And why wouldn't it be the Gambia? Why wouldn't it be a small state? And here we see the increasing use of the International Court of Justice, and I'm going to come to this in the next part of my talk, by small states, where this is the great equalizer, where if you do not have the diplomatic resources, if you don't have the folks in The Hague, in Geneva, in New York, who are willing to go to bat, if you don't have those resources, and if you don't have that political capital to spend, refer to a court of law. The ICJ has actually heard 55 territorial disputes, for example, over the course of its history, or its 80 years, and 85% of them, and brought by small states in the most instances, and 85% of them have been implemented and complied with. And then we're going to talk in a minute about one of the great advances of the ICJ with regards to environmental law, and also brought by small states. So I don't know if that's a thorough answer to your question, but I think we're going to come back to that in just a second. So I don't want to forecast too much. I'll just also point out in this Myanmar example that there is also a UN-backed independent investigative mechanism, the IIMM for Myanmar, which is collecting evidence. So these all work in tandem. Independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, IIMM. Yeah. I don't want to gloss over this because I know it's an issue that everybody in this room is probably thinking about. But another example of complementary and overlapping jurisdiction is, of course, with regards to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. And here I'm using the language of the ICJ. So the ICJ issued an advisory opinion in July of last year, 2024, on the legal consequences of Israel's prolonged occupation. And it also has issued a provisional order in the case brought by South Africa under the Genocide Convention concerning Gaza. And here that Gambia, the Myanmar case, paved the way for the use of, one might call it universal jurisdiction, but an ergo omnes obligation. And so South Africa, without claiming any personal or specific state interest, brought a genocide case against Israel. And separately, the ICC prosecutor has sought arrest warrants for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by both Israeli and Palestinian actors, some now deceased, that focus on the individual level. And then we also have national and regional mechanisms, from Spain's universal jurisdiction laws to UN fact-finding missions that are producing parallel records of accountability. And this again shows how domestic and international systems can interact. So I just want to quickly deal with some criticisms and misconceptions of primarily the ICC, but I guess international justice writ large. So one, probably the most common refrain that I hear is international justice targets Africa and Africa disproportionately. And it's true that most of the ICC's first cases were in Africa. This is Ukraine, Congo, Sudan, Kenya. But most of those were actually self-referrals. African governments, Uganda, DRC, Mali, CARC, Central African Republic, asked the ICC to intervene when national systems couldn't cope. And African judges, prosecutors, and lawyers, or my friends and colleagues, have been integral and central in shaping the International Criminal Court. And then also in recent years, the ICC has expanded dramatically, opening investigations in Afghanistan, Ukraine, Georgia, Venezuela, and Palestine. So it's not about targeting regions, about where crimes occur and where jurisdiction allows. The second most frequent question or criticism that I get is that the ICC is political. And this is true. all justice is vulnerable to politics, especially when enforcement depends on states. None of these courts has its own enforcement mechanism. But the alternative isn't neutrality. The alternative is impunity. So the court's task is to apply the same legal standards to all parties, even when doing so offends the powerful. And then the third refrain that I get is that international courts don't work. Yes, it's true. They rarely act quickly and they can't prevent every atrocity, but they do shape behavior. Gave that example of Nicaragua v. US, where US said it wouldn't cooperate, but hey, the policy changed. And also, commanders know that their orders are recorded. Leaders know their names may one day appear on indictments, and victims know that their suffering has been recognized in law. So justice at the international level is slow, imperfect, and profoundly human, but it is justice. So the rule of law under threat. And unfortunately, this is something that is hitting a little bit close to home these days, and of which I'm keenly aware. So even as I have now been, sorry, I see a hand. No, of course. Let me come over to you first.
I say this on behalf of everyone. I understand how uncomfortable it is to be criticized and to feel the pressure of everyone, but like you and I and our privilege and what we have and the luck that we have for our geography, I don't want to feel like we are looking for sympathy from people. I know it's uncomfortable and I know it's hard, but we have to keep facing that every single time. So I just want to encourage you to keep trying. And like, I know it's not a perfect system, but I'm upset about what's happening in Palestine. And this has been going on a lot longer than TikTok has been around. And I feel like there's been a lot more proof that's already been given in the past, and much more could have been done sooner.
Thank you so much for that. So I personally have had to have difficult conversations in the last days with colleagues because I work on situations with victims and survivors in Palestine about limiting my contact because of the threat of sanctions. So we're turning now into the rule of law under threat. So the United States, for example, has imposed sanctions on ICC officials, threatened prosecutions for those cooperating with the court, and rejected its jurisdiction over alleged offenses in Afghanistan and Palestine. So currently, as of today, could change tomorrow, the sanctions extend to 13 organizations and individuals. Those include judges of the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor, his deputy prosecutors, and they now include 3 Palestinian human rights organizations where I have friends whom I can no longer officially contact because although normally US citizens are barred from sanctions ourselves, we are vulnerable to pretty significant retaliation. That includes criminal penalties of potentially up to 30 years in prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in civil liabilities. So we all who are doing this work, who are working with victims and survivors, trying to figure out how to continue under this current administration at home. And at the same time that we're dealing with these threats at home in the United States, ICC member states, the United States is not an ICC member state, are encouraged in some cases not to cooperate with the court. So we had seen this previously with Omar al-Bashir, who is responsible for atrocities, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity on a massive scale in Sudan, not being arrested, and during his numerous visits to states parties to the Rome Statute. But we've seen it quite recently and in stark relief in several instances, including Italy failing to arrest a Libyan suspect, and of numerous states parties to the Rome Statute saying that they would have to consider, or they may or may not comply with their obligation under law to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu and Gallant and anyone else who is indicted by the ICC. Actually, we also saw Netanyahu fly over airspace of numerous ICC member states during his recent visit to the United States. And that itself could be seen as obfuscation or obstruction of cooperation and their duties under international law. So in addition to all of this, there are funding cuts, there are disinformation campaigns, there are attacks on judges and investigators. And so these are not abstract, they're deliberate attempts to intimidate those who stand for victims and survivors. I had a participatory exercise here. I think we'll still do this. Why not? So these are 4 different scenarios, and I'll just go to one table each and ask you for your answer in about 2-3 minutes. Here we have, and there is an answer to each of these. The last one will be open-ended, but this one, there is an actual right answer, so to speak. So a state bombs a neighboring country claiming self-defense. So which court would this go to? Scenario 2, a general orders mass killings of civilians inside their own country. Scenario 3, a journalist is imprisoned for criticizing the president. Scenario 4, 2 states dispute ownership of an island chain in the ocean. So how about we do this? Why don't we assign this side of the room, tables over here to 1, tables in this corridor to 2, right? Getting us? Tables over here to 3, tables this, not to 4. That all make sense? All right, I'll give you a couple minutes to think about that. Okay, are we almost settled on our answers here? All right, so I'm going to ask tables, we're going to say 1 and 2 over here, that were seized of scenario 1. A state bombs a neighboring country claiming self-defense. So which court or which body do you think that this would go to?
National, like the international court. This is a ICC violation, no, because it's country to country. Also, self-defense is one of the reasons why you could. So, is that right? Is international?
I'm gonna just go to your neighbors here to make sure that they get their say too.
I'm sorry. I'm here. I'll take it.
Thank you for being a college student. I would also agree with Anya. It would be international because a state is a state country. So with it being country to country, it's international.
Yeah, so it's the International Court of Justice to be precise. And here it's important that we differentiate between the International Court of Justice, which hears disputes between states, as opposed to the International Criminal Court. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so now we have a general orders mass killings of civilians inside their own country. So we'll start with this table, and then we got 2 tables behind you.
We think it can go both to the ICJ and the ICC because the general is an individual, but it's within his own country. That's our guess.
At first, we said it was the ICJ, but I'm thinking that it's actually the International Criminal Court.
Okay, and one more table over here. Are you a part of this table? Okay, this is the International Criminal Court because it is an individual here, and it's inside their own country. So it's not a state-to-state dispute. It is a dispute that is residing within the country's borders. And because this is within their own country, they would have to be a state party to the Rome Statute. And this would be considered, therefore, a crime against humanity rather than a war crime. And then this is the court for scenario 3. So a journalist is imprisoned for criticizing the president.
Regional,
Can you speak into the mic?
that would be the regional specific court, we think.
And this table over here?
We're at 4, but you can answer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, you're 4? Okay. Okay, so yes, this would be a human rights court. So yes, if there's not domestic jurisdiction, and we're assuming that in this case, probably that the country in question does not have the appetite to take up the issue, that this would be, you know, for a European Court of Human Rights, an Inter-American Court of Human Rights, an African Court of Human and People's Rights. Because it is the offense against an individual by the state. Okay, so now we have scenario 4, 2 states dispute ownership over an island chain in the ocean. Anybody?
We were discussing.
Oh, you were 3. I'm sorry, and I gave the answer already. Did you have any further comments on 3? Okay, all right. I'll hang over here to 4 then.
ICJ.
I think it's the International Criminal or Court of Justice.
Yeah, exactly. This is a territorial dispute. It's between states. As I said, there have been 55 that have been peacefully resolved with implementation in 85% of circumstances from the founding of the court. So here we go. ICJ state responsibility under the UN Charter. ICC or ad hoc tribunal. I left that out in my answer. Individual criminal liability, regional human rights court, and then a boundary dispute goes to the ICJ. And the idea is that no single court handles everything, and they overlap by design. So in the final portion of my discussion here with you today, I'd like to talk about some of the activities that I'm currently engaged in, and that you can be as well, in terms of the new frontiers of international law, and would really like to reflect upon how international law is constantly evolving. We talked about how it began as an ideal and how it became an imperfect but vital system of global courts and treaties. And we traced its journey from Nuremberg to the current global order. And so now we're going to look forward. We're not frozen in time. This is evolving often faster than we realize. And when crises, as mentioned by my colleague in the back there, hit the headlines, something remarkable tends to happen often beneath the surface, which is the law between nations evolves faster. And I would say more democratically and more creatively than at any point in history. So from new crimes to new institutions, the law between nations is being reimagined before our eyes. So I'm going to give you a few case studies, and I'm involved with each of these. And if you're interested in any one, please come to me afterwards. Perhaps the most frequently, well, no, actually, I'm going to go in the order this is mentioned. So one of the most exciting proposals that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, when I say I deal with, I mean I am out there trying to get state party support. I'm trying to rally civil society. I've worked on the drafting committee of the foundational treaty, is a proposed new court. And you'd say, well, we have so many international courts and tribunals. Why do we need more? And how much is this going to cost? I can answer all those questions. But this is an international anti-corruption court. And so this idea was first advanced by Judge Mark Wolf, who's a senior federal judge of the District of Massachusetts, and Justice Richard Goldstone, former Supreme Court Justice of South Africa and the first prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, among many other accolades. So it's now being championed by states including Canada, the Netherlands, and Ecuador, an increasing number on the African continent, and a growing coalition of supporters worldwide. And so this court, the International Anti-Corruption Court, recognizes that corruption isn't just a domestic problem. It's by definition almost transnational. So money flows across borders, it's laundered through shell companies, real estate, and offshore accounts. And yet national justice systems can't or won't often prosecute kleptocrats. And so this IACC would prosecute the world's most powerful, the leaders who loot their nations and launder stolen billions through global financial systems. So the ICC would fill a void, once again using the complementarity principle, stepping in, therefore, only when domestic justice fails, and recognizing that grand corruption doesn't just drain treasuries, it undermines democracy, fuels conflict, and corrodes the rule of law itself. And so if created, the IACC could become to governance what the ICC is to atrocity crimes. It's a deterrent, it's a court of last resort, and it's a signal that impunity is not inevitable. All right. I'll move now to new crimes and enlarging jurisdiction. So I'll take the ICC, and I was at the UN on Monday of this week at the working group for amendments to the Rome Statute, where this is very au courant. This is very much what we're seized of and what we're speaking about. So the number one most discussed amendment to the Rome Statute is probably the addition of a fifth crime. So the Rome Statute currently is genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, crime of aggression, with an asterisk that I'll get to in a minute. So the proposed fifth crime is the crime of ecocide. So this is defined, and it does have a legal definition now, thanks to an expert panel, as widespread, severe, or long-term environmental destruction committed with knowledge of its impact. So this amendment was championed by small island states and environmental advocates, and recognizes that destroying the earth can be as catastrophic as destroying a people. So island nations and small states and global civil society groups have come together arguing that from deforestation to oil spills to climate negligence, these should all be treated with the same moral gravity as crimes against humanity. And this would, if adopted, this would be the first new international crime since 1945. Yeah. So the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court is not retroactive. However, I think in this instance, one could say that a crime committed in year X is having an effect in year Y. And so the effect itself would render jurisdiction. So it would not be retroactive for the oil spill in 1999, but it would say that right now in 2018, in 2025, sorry, that this is having this effect. And we'll also talk about the ICJ in just a moment and its really seminal opinion on climate change. So the next set of amendments that are up for discussion this year, so the Assembly of States Parties is the governing body of the International Criminal Court, and it meets every December. So the next set of amendments is on slavery and the slave trade. So I think more by oversight than intentional omission, in 1998, when the Rome Statute was being negotiated, slavery was only included as sexual slavery as a crime against humanity. So sexual slavery leaves out all kinds of slavery. And as a crime against humanity, it's not also accounted for as a war crime. So there have been, as of this week, Monday of this week, was the latest conviction by the ICC, the first conviction in the instance in the situation in Darfur. And of those 14 cases, approximately half, I think, you would have seen additional crimes prosecuted had the crimes of slavery and the slave trade been included within the jurisdiction of the court at the time that the court was seized of those, which it was not. So thousands of victims and survivors of those crimes went unanswered. So introduced by Sierra Leone 2 years ago and coming up for discussion this year, these would make major amendments to the Rome Statute to correct jurisdictional gaps. And I also just want to point out that when we talk about slavery here, we're not talking about, a lot of states use the term modern slavery, which is shorthand for human trafficking. We're actually talking about the practice of slavery, which is ongoing in every region of the world today, and is not synonymous with human trafficking. The slave trade is the forcible transfer of a human being from one hand to another. And that is what is more, it's a little bit closer to what we think about as human trafficking. But these are deliberate terms, legal terms, slavery and the slave trade. And the last amendment to the Rome Statute that is up this year, again, it's unfortunately been forecasted for a little bit longer of a runway, is the crime of aggression. So we think about this as the foundational crime that birthed the international justice ecosystem as we know it, and yet has not been prosecuted and basically cannot be prosecuted because of the jurisdictional gaps. And beyond the other, it's exceptional to the other three crimes in the Rome Statute in that you have to actually have ratified amendments made in Kampala, Uganda in 2010 to then be able to prosecute or be prosecuted for the crime of aggression, which is the illegal use of force between states. I also just want to speak briefly about the International Court of Justice moving beyond the ICJ. So the ICJ hears cases in a number of ways. Oh, yes, sorry. Come over here.
Prisoners of war, those of us who were brought out as prisoners, would that fit in anything that you know?
So because the ICC does not look at, it's again a question of retroactive jurisdiction, it's not seized of reparations in that way that other courts or even domestic policy or regional policy could be. But again, the states that are most seized of the issue of preventing this crime in the present day and in the future day are states that have suffered disproportionately, led by African states, Caribbean states, et cetera. Sorry.
So the concept of prison of war rather than captured to be enslaved, is the language lend itself to any case?
Okay, and now I understand your question. Excellent, excellent question. The language used by the perpetrators does not matter. It is the circumstances under which the victim is held, the survivor is held, and whether or not they are in line with international humanitarian law, in this case, international criminal law. And so whether or not a warlord calls you a prisoner of war and says that this is a legitimate activity under the laws of war, well, yeah, it probably would have been in 1899 or 1914, but it is not in 2025. And so this So I'll give you an example. So in the Dominic Ongwen case, this was the first case in which there was a real contemplation on the role of a victim perpetrator. So Dominic Ongwen was a child soldier who was enlisted by the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. And then he went on himself to perpetrate immense atrocities. So he was convicted. It was until this week, the most recent conviction of the International Criminal Court, and he was convicted of crimes against humanity and war crimes, and they included murder and rape and all sorts of horrible things, but they didn't include slavery. And if that had been on the books, they would have included slavery. And you might think of victims. In most cases, maybe you would say that victims would have experienced multiple of these horrors simultaneously, but you could also think of victims who didn't experience the others, but experienced this, like bushwives, for instance. I do have to probably move, yeah. Yeah, so there's no retroactive jurisdiction for the ICC, but in these cases that I'm talking about, like Mr. Ongwen or Mr. Lubanga or Mr. Nedeganda, they were being prosecuted for crimes that were contemporaneous with their state's accession to the Rome Statute. So if slavery and the slave trade had been crimes under the Rome Statute at that time, they would have been prosecuted for those as well as the other crimes against humanity and war crimes of which they were eventually convicted. Happy to talk about this more afterwards. I also just want to quickly mention the expanding reach of the International Court of Justice. So cases reach the International Court of Justice in 4 ways. One is when the states in question agree that this is how they're going to resolve a specific dispute. Another is an advisory opinion process. Another is if a treaty indicates that the International Court of Justice is the method of arbitration and adjudication. But the 4th way is if states accept compulsory jurisdiction of the court. So they say that the court, the World Court, is going to rule over all disputes they have with other states. And only 74 states have done this. And so I currently run a campaign called Legal Alternatives to War, Law Not War, taking its name from the mantra of the late Ben Ferencz, the last living prosecutor at Nuremberg until his death at 101 last year. And we are trying to convince more states to sign up to compulsory jurisdiction. And we see that there are a number that have an appetite to do so. Of course, there will be persistent outliers like the United States. I'll also share quickly another endeavor that I'm involved in, which is, I think, one of the boldest frontiers in terms of reform, which is concerning the veto power. So as we know, the veto is held by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And for decades, that veto has blocked action on mass atrocities and aggression from Syria to Gaza to Ukraine, leaving the international system paralyzed. And so now the UN Security Council veto is under legal scrutiny. And so we have a movement that is now championed informally by several states to ask the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the existing legal limits to the veto, specifically in cases of atrocity, that it would be antithetical to the UN Charter, that it undermines the basic rule of law, so-called Jus Cogens norms, and that it also contrary to the Geneva Conventions that are ratified by all UN member states, to use the veto when it would obfuscate justice in, for example, those situations I mentioned, Syria, Gaza, Ukraine. And here there has been movement. Liechtenstein led an initiative that was successful, requiring that, and in 2023, so very, very recent, requiring that any Security Council member who uses its veto explains its reasoning before the General Assembly. So at least now you have to go on record, and that's not such a small feat, actually, and explain why you did what you did. And so this is a remarkable moment because for the first time, international law is being used to question not only what states do, but how power itself is exercised. So in short, the law is catching up with power and questioning it. I just want to zoom in on a hopeful note with this last point here, which is the ICJ, the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion on Climate Change, which I think is perhaps the most inspiring new development, which comes not from a treaty, but from young people. So shout out to all the students in the audience here. Yeah. So in 2023, a group of law students from the Pacific Islands, organized under the Pacific Islands Students Fighting Change, which ultimately became the Youth for Climate Change global movement, helped persuade their governments to take an extraordinary step, to ask the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, for an advisory opinion on the obligation of states with regards to climate change. So this was ultimately co-sponsored by 130 states. It was the first ever unanimous referral for a request for an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice. And so it affirmed a few groundbreaking principles when the opinion was delivered in July of this year. First, that climate change causes serious harm to present and future generations. I don't think anybody in this room would be surprised by that, but it is now law. 2, that states have legal obligations under existing treaties and customary international law. So by the way, if you exit from the Paris Agreement, customary international law still binds you to prevent and remedy such harm, and that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. So this is pretty seminal. Yeah. And also there have been parallel rulings now by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, the Court of Justice of the European Union, and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And actually, we're in mid-October now, and so we're almost 3 months out from that advisory opinion. And 3 months is the time frame where a implementing resolution needs to be launched. So Vanuatu is currently working on this, going to be talking to their legal advisor next week. So all of these reforms, new courts, new crimes, expanded jurisdiction, and veto scrutiny are part of a broader pattern, which I call the gradual but inevitable democratization of international law. And so where once the system served only states and victors, it now answers to peoples, victims, and even the planet itself. So the story of international law isn't finished, being written right now. And before I close, I'd like to give you the opportunity to contemplate what the next great legal frontier could be. So if you could create one new international court or rule tomorrow, what would it address and how would it enforce its judgments? I'll give you 2 minutes and then I'll just close very briefly because I think we're over time. So we've given you some ideas here for inspiration, but what problem would you solve? Who would enforce, and what resistance might it face? So please talk amongst your tables, and then do try to elect a speaker so that I don't have to run around asking for one. All right, I'll give 1 more minute. Okay, I'm gonna flip things around and go to this side of the room first. So if you'd like to tell us your idea for a new court or a new treaty or a new rule or a new policy, is there anyone?
I think we have a new space force that's everything's cluttered up there, and who has jurisdiction over what space in space they can use, right? And probably the first one, the Climate Justice Tribunal, the whole state's responsible, and corporations that also put things up in the space.
So that's a really interesting point because the space is technically commons that falls under the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, but with the International Court of Justice busier than it's ever been and without subject matter expertise on space issues, who can actually take that forward? And with the advisory opinion on climate change and the obligations of states with regards to climate change, that is going to create, I believe, many of us believe, a torrent of new cases that tribunal does not have the capacity, nor maybe the technical acumen, the subject matter expertise to hear. So absolutely.
I mean, I know something that would be good to address. I just don't know how it would be enforced, and I can imagine the resistance, which is the Global Refugee Rights Court, because there are so many refugees now. But I can't imagine like the legal architecture, the institutional architecture for that.
Yeah, I'm just going to respond to that quickly. So I worked for a number of years with and I still do a little bit pro bono with the International Refugee Assistance Project. And one of the dilemmas that we had is if there isn't a domestic law under which you can prosecute, it doesn't necessarily even need to be the refugee's refugee claim, but other offenses that are committed against the person, to whom do they turn? And so we had to, we continue to do this really complicated gymnastics to try to find a venue for their justice. Yep, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I have a suggestion for capping the amount of income people can make, putting a cap on the top. I'm more of a socialist leftist, but that's just how I am.
Yeah, there's a group called Global Redistribution Advocates that I'll hook you up with.
We've been talking about AI, and it would be nice for once to have the law be ahead of technological development. So it's difficult to imagine how that should happen. The other thing is that it's large transnational corporations who are doing all of this. And so it needs, entities beyond nation states to oversee what's happening.
Just to go with Holger's point, I mean, the question about what resistance might it face, it was easier to see the resistance in a climate justice tribunal because, nations that produce emissions don't want to be regulated, whereas nations that are suffering from that want the regulation. But in the case of AI misuse, it seemed to me that's a global constituency. Everybody wants their privacy protected. Everybody hates AI. Let's just say it, right? And so I think that's maybe an easier sell. Oh, I see people saying no at that table. Okay.
So last year, there was something called the Summit of the Future that was hailed as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, once-in-a-generation opportunity for UN reform. And what emerged out of that was a pact for the future and 2 annexes, a declaration for future generations and a global digital compact. And with the Global Digital Compact, the main step going forward is going to be AI governance, and AI for good, AI for ill, AI for, I guess there's neutral AI. So this is very much being contemplated right now, and whether or not there should be a UN agency or a new treaty on AI is something that's literally happening as we speak.
Hi. So a law that I would love to see that would probably, I'm too pessimistic to believe would ever happen, is to actually give back to the victims of genocide and the victims of war crime. I can say with personal experience, I have a cousin who was murdered from Israel in an airstrike last year. I've seen the hell it goes through in my own family. I've seen the trauma. And that's only with one cousin. That's not even including my extended family. And as much as people saying, hey, that was bad would be nice, it's just that. People saying, oopsie daisies, and calling it a day. My aunt was homeless. My childhood home, gone. So having somebody to help you rebuild that. I know in Gaza, they're facing starvation. You can't just throw a sandwich at them and call it a day. Refeeding syndrome, all these different things. A lot of things that cost a lot of money that, hey, if you just got bombed, you probably don't have. So actually getting that help instead of a oopsies would be phenomenal.
Thank you so much for sharing that powerful story. So as I mentioned obliquely, you know, I am privileged to work with Palestinian human rights organizations and now a little bit delimited. But so everybody has personal stories to share. One of the innovations of the International Criminal Court is that it includes a separate body called a trust fund for victims. And that body has a dual mandate for reparations and assistance. And so the reparations are supposed to be monetary allotments and also community building activities for victims and survivors. And then the assistance mandate is to rebuild entire communities. Now, all of that rests, of course, on getting convictions in a court of law and seeing justice. And so while we have negotiated peace agreements in, I'll refrain from air quotes, but in that situation and in others, until there is the accountability, there can't be justice for victims. And we do not have the prospect of those reparations and assistance, which of course are, that it does in no way fill the void. But it is an attempt of the international judicial system and the international legal order to confront what you've just said, that good wishes are not enough. Do we have something over here? Oh, sorry. I was just going like corridor by corridor, but yeah, why not? As long as everyone gets heard.
My heart is with all oppressed people everywhere, but I especially want us to take a note to Wichita, Kansas, because we do need a climate justice tribunal. I don't know if you know, but right here in Northeast Wichita, Union Pacific has been poisoning our people. We do not have clean water. We do not have clean soil. We do not have clean air. And as a result, the health outcomes of Northeast Wichita is poor. We have liver cancer. We have low birth rates. We have poor maternal health outcomes. That is something that we need to be talking about as a community, and also charges that should be brought against Union Pacific, charges that should be brought against the city of Wichita, the county of Sedgwick County, the state of Kansas, because it happened on their watch and they turned a blind eye. When you can tell me you can clean up downtown Wichita, when you can clean up downtown Wichita, but you can't clean up Northeast Wichita where the Black and brown people are, that's environmental racism. And so I think a climate justice tribunal, even here locally, there are charges to be brought. And the folks in Northeast Wichita need us, all of us, to bring that. Additionally, I want to talk about reparations for descendants of enslaved people. We need to be figuring it out. We also need to be figuring out the 13th Amendment, because slavery is real and it's legal. What we do to prisoners in this state is despicable and deplorable. It is slavery. It is slavery. It is slavery. And it's a violation, and it's crimes against humanity. And until we stand up and say no more, we're going to continue to have these loopholes, and we're going to continue to have our people shipped off from preschool to prison. It happens. And so you don't have to explain anything to me. I understand it. I already know what the resistance is. I already know who will and won't enforce it. But we have laws and we have policies that we need to be advocating for the rights of the people who are most marginalized.
Yes. Aonya, I can't tell you that how disturbing it was to me at the last conference of the American Society of International Law last year. There was going to be a resolution on slavery and reparations, and they were worried about getting a quorum in the room. What? What? And I was, I was asked, like, Becca, can you go get your people to come to the room to vote on this resolution? So a resolution on reparations with regards to slavery at the American Society of International Law last year, which did pass. Were there any other?
Said about the young people and climate, but something just passed. Well, could that potentially help Wichita, as well as the fund for Palestine? Could that one potentially help reparations if we made a case?
Yeah, so this is the wonderful coming together of Aonya's work at the local level with the international cases that we're talking about. That climate case is binding on every country, every nation state. And then with our federal system, that boils down to the state level. And then that boils down to the city level. So you can use the language of the advisory opinion in your local advocacy within your community. This is a crime under international law, full stop. It's not a matter of interpretation. Yeah. Does anyone else want to come in?
On a different topic though. Okay, so my problem would be suicide overdose. I recently overdosed on 2,200 milligrams of hydroxyzine for suicide. I was transported to EMS, long story, not going to get into it. But the reason I would solve this issue is because it is not okay. This mental health system is crap. I will amen to that because the school system, they did not really help. It is complex how the mental health system here in Kansas is really complex and it needs to be fixed. Now, they're pumping out these mental health advisors and they're not treating them like they understand. They're saying, hey, do this, do this. Here's a CAMS form. They're not treating them like, okay, here, maybe this might help. No, it's like, what are you doing? You're not understanding, hey, maybe actually talk to the damn motherfucking person. Yeah, I'm going to use some strong language. We're all fucking adults. But why? Why are these mental health professionals understanding that prescription medication should be monitorized? Yes, hydroxyzine is not lethal. Yes, I work for an organization that monitors, gives out fentanyl overdose and stuff, and does that. The reason I started is because I had a history in overdose, and I knew I had an addiction. And I'm working on it, and it sucks, and it's hard. And yes, I'm not very clean, but I am clean now, and I'm working on it. And I figured I'd say something now because it matters whether you're 1 day clean or 20 years clean. It still matters as long as you're facing it with your face head on. And I thank Aonya because she's the one who brought me on.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. So with that, I think we are well over time, and I will close us out just with a few thoughts of reflection that I hope bring to bear some of what you've shared in this room today. We started off with the timeline. So we started with Grotius writing in 1625, the first international court appearing in 1899, Nuremberg in 1945, and the ICC opening its doors in 2022. And when we look at that trajectory, the lesson is not one of steady progress. It's one of fragile invention, a centuries-long struggle. And that struggle is live today. It's a struggle to bind power with principle and to turn morality into mechanism. International law is not ancient wisdom, it's a recent promise, and like all promises, it can be broken. And that means that the whole enforceable international legal order, everything we've pointed to here, has existed for less than one human lifetime and is not self-sustaining. International law has no police, no standing army. It only survives because states and citizens believe it matters. So when countries invade others in defiance of the UN Charter, when war crimes go unpunished, when human rights are dismissed as political, that structure cracks. The system we built after 1945 was meant to make another world war impossible. But that system, like peace itself, isn't natural. It's a choice renewed every day. And so it is up to us, whether we're lawyers or diplomats, or whether we're everyday citizens, to remember how young this system is, how easily it could vanish, and how much suffering went into creating it. And if we forget that, we risk returning to a world where might makes right and the law of nations once again becomes the law of the jungle. So thank you. And I'm very happy to stay and talk with everybody and give you my contact information and further details on any of the current campaigns that you've heard about today.
I just want to thank everybody for coming out this evening and making this such a fantastic event. Thank you very much, Rebecca Shute. We appreciate you coming to speak with us this evening. And I also want to thank Aonya Barnett, who I think maybe snuck out for a minute. But thank you to her for coming out, and all of you at Safe Streets Wichita. Thank you very much for all the work you do. And thank you for coming out. And I just want to let everyone know that Safe Streets has a table in the back. And there are there's some naloxone and some other harm reduction supplies there. So please stop by the table and check those out before you leave. And everybody have a fantastic night. Thank you for coming.